Welcome to the Doggy Dojo podcast. I'm your host, Susan Light, a Los Angeles-based dog trainer on a quest to become worthy of the title Sensei of the Doggy Dojo. I'm really excited about today's episode. Nutrition has been on my list since I started the podcast. I was hoping to find a simple answer for when clients ask me what to feed their dogs, but it turns out there's no cookie cutter response. There is a right answer though, and my guest is going to help us break it down and give you a place to start. Show us how to determine what your dog needs and what's the best food to help them get it. She's got so much knowledge that I had to break it into 2 episodes. She's a registered vet tech for 13 years and has spent the last 7 years learning about canine nutrition. She's an NAVC certified pet nutrition coach and completed canine nutrition courses from the Science Dog and the University of Tennessee. She's got resources for pet parents with questions on her blog and her social media accounts. Please welcome the Canine Health Nut, Nikki Giovanelli. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I have to tell you that this topic has been on my list since I started the podcast. I've been dying to talk to somebody about canine nutrition because almost every single, and certainly every single one of my clients with a new puppy ask me about what they should feed their dog.
Yeah, it's honestly, I feel like you can't have a dog or even a human child or anything without thinking okay, well, what am I supposed to feed them on a regular basis? Because you have to make that decision every day, right? That's a decision you're going to make every time you put something into a bowl or into an enrichment item of okay, well, what goes in here? And so it makes sense for it to be a common question.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's not a simple answer.
No.
And I think that's what's so confounding is the more you get into it, the more complicated it gets.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people want to reach for the simple answer, and that's where we got a lot of misinformation, or they have tried to simplify it so it makes better sense in their head. So they try to make it fit into a little box, and really it's a complicated topic, and there's so many things that influence what the ideal diet would be for a particular dog. It's not just one question, it's a whole slew of questions you need to answer to decide on that. So
yeah, and I think also part of the problem is there's so much trust that we have in the industry and in the government that we assume if a product is on the market that it's a good product. And so, especially when we have something that is a complete, supposedly nutritional product, a kibble, it's most dog owners' assumption they can just go to the store, buy a bag of kibble, feed it to their dog, and everything's fine. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah, I think that it's hard because we do have this body. So in the US, we have AAFCO, so the American Association of Feed Control Officials, and they do have some rules around what products can go to the market, but the rules around that are really basic. So for as far as putting a diet together, they have to formulate to AAFCO standards in order to put AAFCO labeling on a product to say that it's complete and balanced. So basically what that means is that they have to have run a typical or a guaranteed analysis. So looking at protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And then they also have to look at ash and fiber content, which is a fairly basic profile. They have to have it formulated to, they don't have to have done any testing on the diet to make sure it contains everything. They just have to formulate it to AAFCO. And that can be very deceiving. So with dogs, we do have digestibility studies where they see that certain types of meats or combinations of ingredients actually influence other ingredients, which will lower digestibility of maybe an essential amino acid or a type of fat. So just formulating a diet to AAFCO standards can leave gaps in a diet actually being complete and balanced. And even the formulated to aspect, there's no regulation over who formulates a diet. So technically, according to AAFCO, Joe Schmo, your neighbor, can formulate a food using an Excel spreadsheet, and as long as the numbers look like they go out, then that diet is formulated to AAFCO. But he might not know anything about pet nutrition. He might have just taken maybe a weekend class on how to formulate a diet, which really isn't extensive knowledge on the topic of nutrition. He might pick things that don't go together well or that cause poor digestibility. So there's a lot of gaps in the, I guess, regulations around products that can come to market. There's also a lot of regulations, or a lack of regulations, I would say, around quality control procedures. So AAFCO oh, go ahead.
Let me stop you there because I have so many questions about what you've already said.
Sure.
And then I know there's more, but like just a couple of things that you said. So they have to have these standards to get the AAFCO label on them. Can a product hit the market without that label? Can it just be on the shelf and they're not allowed to carry that label, but they can still sell it as a food?
So you can have products that are in the U.S., so labeling is a little different worldwide. So I'm focusing on the U.S. labeling in this instance. But a food can be complete and not balanced. You see this a lot with, if you're familiar with like 80-10-10 raw grinds, those will be often labeled as complete, but they won't be labeled as complete and balanced. And what that means is it contains the proteins and amino acids that your dog needs, but it may or may not contain all the vitamins and minerals that your dog needs. So the labeling on it, if it doesn't
misleading.
say, it can be really confusing. I would say that most people probably in the raw community know with the grinds that you need to add usually additional things to them if they're not labeled complete and balanced in order to make them complete and balanced. It's kind of like a base, if that makes sense.
Okay.
It'll be a combination usually of like bone, organ meat, and muscle meats that are together that they can add in other things like maybe some mussels and some vegetables and some other supplements, sometimes iron, depending on the meat and stuff that's used. Now, as far as if you go into like a Petco, you usually don't have those 80-10-10 grinds in like a Petco or like a PetSmart. But what you will see is diets that are for supplemental feeding only. So it'll actually say on there, and these are usually toppers. So you don't usually see kibbled products that are for supplemental feeding only, but you will see canned products and like little products that come in pouches, and those will say supplemental feeding only, which means that they are not complete and balanced. So they can use as a topper onto food. Usually a nutritionist, like Borders nutritionists, usually say around 10% of your diet can come from treats and additions without having to worry about unbalancing the overall diet. So like those toppers could make up part of that 10% category for it, but they shouldn't go over that, or you may unbalance your
a kibble that's marketed to be your dog's base food couldn't reach the market in the United States or the shelf without getting that AAFCO label and meeting that standard.
So you can put it on a shelf, like you can sell a dog food that's not labeled to AAFCO in the U.S., but you can't sell it over state lines. Certain states require AAFCO, other states don't. It has to be adopted as a state rule.
Oh, wow.
So like in
even more complicated.
Yeah, so California does require AAFCO for foods to be brought onto market. So they're going to have some type of AAFCO statement on them. But I forget, but certain states do not actually require that. So if you're using a brand that's sold outside of state, it should have some type of AAFCO statement on it, because it's more of a federal, like national regulation versus state. So you're crossing a state line. It's kind of like internationally sold foods will have to go with multiple labeling instructions as well. So it's complicated, but
it's so complicated.
But for the most part, basically most foods, if you go into a Petco or something that's a well-established, like, or even a pet boutique, most foods, I would say, unless you're going to a farmer's market, will have an AAFCO statement on them. So, I don't think you would have to worry too much about them not having that on there. There will be a statement. It's just going to be hard to find, probably size 5 to 8 print near the ingredients list or the guaranteed analysis. It'll have that statement on there, but really for AAFCO recommendation, it has to be somewhere on the bag giving that information. But
but the issue is that statement does not guarantee that this is food that will give your dog a healthy life, basically.
No, it's just labeling. So it makes it so if it has an AAFCO statement, they've at least formulated it to the AAFCO nutrient profile. So it'll say like formulated to an AAFCO nutrient profile, and that means that it's been at least formulated to that. But if they haven't done, so there can be gaps basically. So if at the end of, say, the manufacturing process, they do the guaranteed analysis, which checks like your macro content, but they haven't done a typical analysis looking at like vitamins and minerals, it's possible there could be formulated to, but processing has affected maybe the B vitamins or, the vitamin E or something to make it less like available or less present than what they formulated it to at the beginning. So if they don't do a typical analysis, they haven't double checked their product in entirety. So usually I tell people like, hey, if you're going to go out and purchase a food, ask the company if they have done typical analysis on their product to look at how formulating and processing has kind of come together and produce the product. So to see if basically processing method has affected the formulation. That's a better way of putting it.
That makes sense. So like the ingredients that they start out with versus after what actually ends up in the kibble, like after it's been cooked and processed.
Right. And then there's a third. So that's like check number 1 to make sure a diet is balanced, right? You formulate it, then you're going to check it at the end, the full typical analysis to check all your vitamins and minerals and your macros and everything like that to make sure they're all there. Now, the next step, which would be step 3, is feeding it to an animal and seeing how they digest that product. So ingredients can work together. So like we have research that looks at if you include soybeans at above about 15 to 17%, depending on the research study you look at, they actually start to influence protein digestibility negatively. So certain combinations of ingredients can affect the overall digestibility of the diet. So now you have a typical analysis. So step 3
That's true for humans as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's the same kind of idea, and you feed it to an animal and then you see what the digestibility of those nutrients is. And then that would be like your last kind of step in the process to see about if your dog's getting everything that they need.
How do they judge that? They run tests on the animal and see if they have nutrient deficiencies?
No. So what they actually do is they do a stool test. So there's no actually really good like blood test to test for nutritional deficiencies. Like our dogs and us, we're really good at our bodies staying in homeostasis, meaning like if a diet doesn't contain enough calcium, your dog's going to pull calcium from their bones in order to keep everything normal. And then eventually over years, calcium will depleted so much from the bones that they'll end up with like fracturing their bones from like, jumping off of a bed or something like that. So you can't.
So you may not know for years and years and years that the diet you've been feeding them has been causing problems. So they can tell that in the stool?
Yeah. So what they can do is they basically they take that typical analysis and then they take a stool sample after the dog's been eating it. Typically, what I've heard of as like more of a gold standard is you have the dog transition onto the diet for about 2 weeks to 3 weeks. And then you take a week's worth of stool samples and then kind of compare what goes out. So what's left after eating with what was in the food. And then you calculate it with an equation to figure out how digestible everything was. So you're looking at
because if it came out in the stool, their body didn't use it.
Right. And I mean, so that's the basic test that most companies would do if they're doing digestibility studies. There are very intense tests. So every dog's microbiome is a little bit different and how they digest things is a little bit different. So there are more invasive digestibility studies that you can do in dogs. Typically, these aren't done by pet food companies. These are where they actually do a cannulation. So they place a tube into the digestive tract and look at contents within different points of the digestive tract to see how it's digesting and what the composition is at each point.
Wow, that sounds expensive though.
Yeah, probably. Well, and it's invasive. Most companies don't want to be cannulating dogs into putting tubes into different places of their stomach. That's very invasive. But for most companies, if they're going to do digestibility studies, basically they just feed the dogs a diet for a month and then they test usually at the end of that period for like a week. They'll get samples and then they'll run these tests as far as comparing the in and the out to get how digestible it is. So that's like the end of it. Ideally, you do that in combination with like a long-term trial looking at a whole bunch of different blood work parameters and things like that as well, to see if any of those things are abnormal, like liver values or kidney values or anything like that related to the food, where maybe two foods come together and it produces a toxic substance. I would imagine that's relatively unlikely, but you'd be testing for significant abnormalities. And those tests, usually, that's an AAFCO feeding trial in particular, it's supposed to be 6 months. But recommendations by boarded nutritionists say that it should be probably closer to a year and have a very extensive amount of testing done. So AAFCO does advocate or does have like labeling for AAFCO feeding trials, which are 6 months, and they have to test like 4 blood parameters, which really isn't a lot. I think they can just do like they can do like a liver value, a kidney value, and like there's multiple liver and kidney values, and then they can test stew quality, and then they'll test like urine or something like that. So they can test just like a couple values for 6 months and say it's a feeding trial. Most boarded nutritionists recommend a year-long trial though, and they recommend doing like a full CBC chem with testing like B12 and other different types of inflammatory markers and things like that for a year-long trial rather than just a little 6-month trial. So,
but all of these are done by the company making the food and at their discretion, and then they can release or not release the results. Is that correct?
Yes.
Or if they do the trials, are they bound to release the results?
No, they don't have to.
So if the results don't go that well, they maybe do. They just don't publish it?
Yeah, they don't have to publish it.
Yeah.
It's not publicly available data at all.
We're going to take a quick break, but you can get more from Nikki on her blog, www.thecaninehealthnut.com, and she's Canine Health Nut on Instagram, Pinterest, Facebook, and Twitter. We'll be right back.
I've contacted, so I went through and I actually did like a blog post on like digestibility and pet food. So I went out and I contacted a whole bunch of different pet food companies, and I had the expectation that most likely if a pet food company had a product that probably wasn't as digestible, they probably would not respond. That's if they did the trials at all. Right? Because they don't have to do them. Yeah. So most of the results I got back were saying that all the products were considered highly digestible, which I was kind of expecting. I was expecting to basically have companies brag to me how good it was rather than like disclosing that maybe it wasn't as good as they thought it was. So I would say that when I did some research as far as digestibility numbers to ask for, so I usually ask for dry matter digestibility and then protein digestibility. And when I compare those numbers, they should be at least 80%. Ideally, excellent is over 85% on a dry matter basis. So I'll ask them for that information. If they don't give it to me, then I'm like, you just kind of take that into consideration when you're feeding your dog's food.
But this is, as a pet parent, say I have a dog and I want to feed them kibble because for whatever, it's convenient, it's easy, it's not going to go bad as fast. How do I choose which brand of kibble if these are these 3 markers that you've mentioned? I can't even find that information.
Right. So usually, and this comes to like, I guess my general thing of nutrition is that there's 2 different sides to choosing a pet food. First, you evaluate your dog and their individual needs. So how active are they? What lifestyle do they live? What kind of activity level do they have? What age are they? Do they have any medical conditions? Do they have any allergies, sensitivities? Do they have any other requirements? Like, what does my dog require as far as nutrition? And then I go and seek out the foods that meet those requirements. Hopefully you have a good list of like 10 or so foods that meet the requirements of your dog. If you're unlucky, you might only have like 2 or 3.
Based on the formulation?
based
Now
on
you're talking
just
about?
what your dog needs, as far as like, for example, like if you have a highly active dog. So say we have a dog that is a sled dog. A sled dog needs usually a composition on a caloric basis of about 40% protein, 60% fat, no carbohydrates. They can have a little bit, but they don't need that. Where they're getting their energy is through fat because of how metabolism shifts.
And
Usually,
where does the dog owner find that information about their sled dog? They just
right.
Google?
So the information is in clinical research studies.
Okay.
So small animal clinical nutrition has a section. It's a textbook for veterinarians, but there's a section on activity level for dogs, and then ideal compositions based on activity level.
Okay.
Based off of research studies that have been done over years and years and years.
Okay.
So they found that like a sled dog, so a dog that's running a majority of the day, like high activity, big workload, that dog really doesn't have a carbohydrate requirement or a need because it's going to be metabolically using fat as energy.
Okay.
Whereas if you have a dog that is getting less than 30 minutes of activity a day, they don't actually use fat as energy. They use carbohydrates as energy. Metabolism shifts at about 30 minutes. So you actually may want to go for a diet that is composed of like more moderate protein. So something starting at like 25 to maybe 30 if you want. And then you might want to go lower on the fat, especially since if your dog's not moving a lot, they may not need all those extra calories. Fat is very calorie dense. So you may have a higher carbohydrate amount in that dog. So you may be looking at closer to 30 to 50% carbohydrates, with the other two being closer to like 25 to 30 and then 20 to 30. So it kind of depends on the overall composition, but you'll look at more carbohydrates for a dog that is less active than a dog that is highly active. And then you can kind of see it, I guess, skew towards more fat and less carbohydrates as you go up in activity because of just how dogs metabolize things.
Okay.
But when we look at that, like, and we look at like a sled dog, you need to first find a diet that fits that activity level. If you go to the diet first, you might pick the wrong diet for the activity level, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So I usually start with the pet and think about their individual needs. And then I move over to what diets fit those needs, put those two together. And then when I have choices of diets, then I'm going to go through those diets and ask questions to companies. So I'll go and ask them like who formulated their diets. So is it someone that has a PhD in nutrition? Do they have a board certification in nutrition? Do they use a group of boarded nutritionists with PhD nutritionists, with like food scientists and biochemists? Like, do you use a group of people, one individual? What kind of review process was it? Because none of that is going to be on the pet food label.
Okay.
So I'll ask them that question. Who formulated this and what's their nutritional
Is it sometimes
background?
available online, or
Sometimes.
it's more like you have to reach out individually?
So some companies are really good about telling you about it online. Other ones aren't. I've found that some companies are also very general. So there's this tricky part of the term nutritionist is kind of like in the human realm. The term nutritionist doesn't actually have like a really good substantial definition. Technically, anyone in the animal realm is a nutritionist if they have an interest in animal nutrition. So like, since we're having this conversation, we're both animal nutritionists.
Oh dear.
So you want to ask for education level certifications, more information than like, I'll see many companies will say like, we worked with animal nutritionists, and I'm like, okay, I need a little bit more than that. So then I'll contact and follow up and be like, well, what do you mean? And like, you also don't know the capacity by which they worked with them. So like, did they consult with them once? Is it an ongoing like conversation where like as new research comes up, they have kind of like conversations about diet formulation changes? If, new research comes out that says that a certain ingredient over a certain percentage is no longer a good idea, we want to be able to have that conversation be open with the brand, right? So what's their involvement with the company? Is it on a frequent basis? Can they name the person? So like, will the nutritionist that they talk to actually stand behind the product they formulated? Because some won't, in the sense of they will not allow their name to be attached with a brand.
Wow.
And I've seen some nutritionists that have actually pulled their name from a brand
Ooh.
for various reasons. They may have been on the label at one point, and I know that they formulated the diets, but for some reason it was pulled off. And I'm not privy to like private conversations within companies, but the fact that they can no longer mention the nutritionist that they used to use for formulation.
Maybe they didn't listen to the advice of the nutritionist.
Yeah. They should be having open conversations, and it should be a working relationship.
So overall, a well-chosen kibble can be a good choice for feeding your dog, in your opinion. It's not like feeding them cheeseburgers all day or anything like that.
I think that a well-formulated kibble, so a kibble that has very good quality control, that they've, dotted their I's, crossed their T's, they've made sure it's highly digestible, they've taken all of those extra steps to ensure quality. I would, say that it's a complete and balanced meal. It's almost like, I don't know, my husband's always told me, he's like, if they ever made a bar that was complete and balanced that I could just eat 3 times a day, he's like, I would eat that. The issue, though, is that his needs may not fit that bar. So like if he has an allergy, that won't work with the bar. Maybe he has multiple different conditions. That really doesn't work with the bar. Maybe he has a digestibility problem and the bar is harder to digest than fresh food. That would be an issue. But I don't think that I don't have the opinion that like kibble is inherently bad or, inherently worse. I think that there's benefits of fresh food, but I don't think that necessarily that it's fast food to feed your dog kibbled products, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, my hope is always that a good kibble is a really good foundation for a diet. The hard part is to find what that means. And it's not been made simpler after talking to you. It's been made more difficult, but that's what information does
kind of
sometimes.
like, I feel like as you learn more about nutrition and kind of the complexities in the space, it becomes a little bit overwhelming. But I know that the thing that you can look at as far as if you want to choose a food is one, knowing what your dog's needs are. You can ask your veterinarian what their needs are, and they might be able to give you more information about this would be an ideal composition for your dog. And then you can seek out the food. And then to seek out the food, they actually have questions from WSAVA on questions to ask the pet food company that you could just email them. I have a little bit more questions than they have. I have them on my blog that are more extensive. But the basics are those 2 things, is knowing what's appropriate for your dog's activity level and their health, and then using that to choose a food and asking the company about their quality control procedures and their formulation and the testing that goes on.
Thank you, Nikki, for joining me today. This was not our entire conversation. The rest of it will drop in part 2 in my next episode. My biggest takeaway from this conversation is that you can feel good about feeding your dog a kibble if you follow these 3 steps. Step 1, ask your vet what your dog's ideal composition is. We're talking about percentage of fat, protein, carbohydrates, based on your dog's breed, health, activity level, etc. You could also consult someone who specializes in canine nutrition like Nikki, or a board-certified veterinary nutritionist. Step 2, find which kibbles match this composition. Step 3, verify the claims and vet the company. We'll talk a lot more about why this step is important in part 2, but Nikki has resources to help, and she's done a lot of this legwork already for many companies. I've linked her social handles and her blog, The Canine Health Nut, in the show notes, as well as many other resources she mentioned today. Thanks for coming to the dojo to learn with me this week. This is your aspiring sensei, Susan Light, signing off. If you'd like to find me, I'm at doggydojopodcast.com, or I'm at Susan Light LA on Pinterest, Instagram, and Facebook. The music was written by Mac Light. You can find him at maclightsongwriter.com. If you liked the show, you can support it by subscribing, sharing it with your friends, rating it, and reviewing it on Apple Podcasts. See you in 2 weeks with another new episode of the Doggy Dojo.